The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October of 1882, and by the time Maria Redmond had read it twice through, her hands were trembling so badly that the paper rattled like a dried corn husk in a Kansas wind. Her father was dead. Thomas Redmond, the man who had left her and her mother behind in Cincinnati 13 years ago with nothing but a handshake promise and a saddlebag full of optimism, had died in a town called Harlow Creek, New Mexico Territory, without so much as sending word that he had been ailing. The letter came not from any lawyer but from the county sheriff, a man named Dale Prout, who wrote in tight, slanted script that Thomas Redmond had left behind a piece of land, a deed with Maria's name on it as sole heir, and a number of unsettled obligations that required the attention of next of kin. The sheriff did not go into detail about the nature of those obligations. He simply wrote that the estate needed settling, and that Maria would be wise to come quickly if she intended to claim anything at all. Maria had sat at the small kitchen table in the apartment she shared with her mother above the dry goods store on Walnut Street, and she had read the letter a third time, then a fourth, searching for something in between the sheriff's careful lines. Some expression of what her father's last years had been, some clue as to whether he had thought of them. Whether he had tried to write and simply lost the nerve, or whether he had built himself a new life out west and filed Cincinnati away as a chapter he preferred not to revisit. The letter gave her nothing except the facts, and the facts were stark enough. Her mother, Clara Redmond, had listened to the whole thing from her chair by the window where she sat mending in the afternoon light, and when Maria finished reading aloud, Clara had been quiet for a long moment before she said, "Then you should go." Maria had looked up in surprise. She had expected resistance, or grief, or at least the complicated silence her mother usually wore when Thomas Redmond's name was spoken in the house. "You should go," Clara said again, more firmly, setting down her mending and folding her hands in her lap with the particular composure of a woman who has spent many years convincing the world she is fine. "It is your land now, if there is land. And I will not have you losing something that belongs to you simply because going to claim it is inconvenient. Mother, I cannot just leave you here alone and travel to New Mexico Territory by myself. You are 26 years old, Maria. You have been managing this store alongside me since you were 16. You are more capable than half the men I know, and the railroad goes most of the way now." Clara picked her mending back up. "You will go, see what there is to see, settle whatever needs settling, and come back. It will not take more than a few weeks." Maria had wanted to argue, but there was something in her mother's voice that was not merely practicality. It was permission, perhaps, or release, as though Clara Redmond had been waiting for some version of this moment for years, and had already decided how it would be handled. 3 weeks later, Maria Redmond stepped off the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad at a small station in eastern New Mexico Territory with a single trunk, a carpetbag, a letter of introduction from Sheriff Dale Prout, and the particular expression of a woman who has decided that whatever she finds, she will not be undone by it. Harlow Creek was not what she had imagined. She had expected the sort of rough and lawless sprawl that dime novels described, all dust and gunfire and shouting, but the town she found was something more nuanced than that. It was small, the main street barely 4 blocks long, with a general store, a hotel called the Palmer House that was neither grand nor terrible, a livery, a saloon, a church whose white paint was peeling at the corners, and a scattering of homes built from a mixture of adobe and rough timber. There was a blacksmith shop, a barber, and a small land office squeezed between the barber and the hotel. The whole thing sat at the edge of a wide valley that opened up toward mountains in the west, and the mountains were purple and enormous in the late afternoon light, and Maria had stood in the station yard for a full minute just looking at them, because she had never seen anything like them in her entire life. She hired a boy named Felix to carry her trunk to the Palmer house, and she settled into a room on the second floor that smelled of cedar and old plaster, and she went to find Sheriff Dale Prout before the light failed entirely. Dale Prout was a weathered man in his late 50s with a gray mustache and the kind of eyes that had seen considerable disappointment and made their peace with it. He received her in his small office beside the jail, offered her coffee from a pot that had been on the stove too long, and laid out the situation with the directness of a man who found courtesy but not sentimentality useful. "Your father came out here about 7 years ago," Prout said, settling back in his chair. "He had a piece of land about 4 miles east of town, 160 acres, good water access, decent grass. He filed the deed properly, left it to you by name." He paused. "I will be honest with you, Miss Redmond. Your father was not what you would call a careful man." "I know that," Maria said. "He had debts, not ruinous but real. He borrowed money from 2 or 3 people in town and never got around to paying it back. He borrowed tools from neighbors and returned some of them, not all. He was the kind of man who always meant to do right by things and always seemed to find a reason to get around to it later." Prout said this without malice, simply as the factual portrait of a type he had encountered many times. "He died of pneumonia in late August. Fast, they said, once it got hold of him." "Who are the creditors?" Maria asked. Prout pulled a folded paper from his desk drawer. "Henry Marsh at the general store, $11. Widow Caldwell, who is really not a widow anymore, but that is what people still call her. She lent him $22 2 years ago that he never returned. And then there is Gilbert Brooks." Something in the way Prout said the name made Maria look up from the paper she had been studying. "Brooks owns the Rocking Bee," Prout continued. "It is the ranch that borders your father's land to the south and west. About 3 years ago, when your father's fencing fell to pieces and his cattle were straying onto Brooks's range, Brooks replaced the entire fence line at his own expense and hired 2 of his hands to help repair the roof on your father's house when it blew half off in a spring storm. He also paid the feed bill at the livery twice when your father came up short, and he was the one who found your father sick and brought him into town and paid for the doctor." Prout folded his hands on his desk. "Far as I can tell, Gilbert Brooks has been tending to the obligations of that property for the better part of 3 years, and he never asked for a cent back." Maria was quiet for a moment. "How much does he claim my father owed him?" Prout shook his head slowly. "That is just it, Miss Redmond. He does not claim anything. I asked him myself after your father passed what he was owed because I figured that was part of settling the estate. He told me he was not owed anything, said he had done what any decent neighbor would do." Maria looked at the paper in her hands without reading it. "He sounds too good to be true." Prout smiled for the first time, a small, dry smile that suited him. "He is a serious man and a stubborn one, and he has strong opinions about how things ought to be done. I would not go so far as to call him easy. But in my experience, the people who are too good to be true usually are. Brooks is just the way he is." She thanked the sheriff and walked back to the Palmer house in the cooling evening air, and she thought about a man who had spent 3 years quietly tending the edges of her father's neglected life, not for profit or recognition, but simply because the land was there, and the fence needed mending and the roof would not fix itself. She thought about what that said about him, and she thought about what it said about her father, and both lines of thought were complicated enough that she was not entirely done with either one by the time she reached her room. She spent her first full day in Harlow Creek visiting Henry Marsh, and the woman everyone called Widow Caldwell, whose actual married name was now Perkins, and who was a cheerful, forthright woman of about 40 with 6 chickens in her yard, and an encyclopedic knowledge of everything that had happened in Harlow Creek for the past decade. Maria paid both debts without argument. Widow Caldwell tried to refuse the money twice, and then accepted it with such obvious relief that Maria understood the $22 had been genuinely missed. Henry Marsh, who was a thin and meticulous man who kept beautiful ledgers, accepted the $11, wrote out a receipt, and mentioned, in the careful tone of a man sharing information he considered useful without wishing to meddle, that Gilbert Brooks had been the one who told him Maria was coming and to expect her. He mentioned it, Maria asked. He came by the morning after the sheriff had word you were on your way, Marsh said. Told me he thought you would do right by your father's debts once you knew about them. He was quite certain about it. Maria was not entirely sure how she felt about being the subject of Gilbert Brooks's certainty before she had even arrived in the territory, but she filed the information away and walked out into the dust of the main street and looked eastward down the road that, she had been told, led to her father's land. She rented a horse from the livery, a steady gray mare named Josephine, and rode out the following morning. The road east of town wound through scrub and juniper and opened eventually onto the valley floor, where the grass was autumn pale, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that Maria had already come to think of as belonging specifically to New Mexico, a color deeper and more uncompromising than anything Ohio produced. The Redmond property, when she found it, was identifiable by its fence line, which was in considerably better repair than the house itself. The house was a small adobe structure with a plank porch and a roof that had been patched in several places with boards that did not quite match. There was a windmill at the back corner of the property that turned slowly in the light breeze, and a small barn that smelled of old hay and horses when she pushed the door open, but no animals remained. Maria walked through the house alone, her boot heels echoing on the plank floors. There were her father's things, a coat on a hook by the door, a tin cup on the windowsill, a bunk with a blanket folded neatly at the foot of it, and she wondered who had folded it. A small wooden box on the shelf above the cold stove that, when she lifted the lid, contained 3 photographs. One was of a woman Maria did not recognize. One was of the landscape east of the house, as though her father had wanted to remember this view specifically, and the third was of Maria herself, taken on her 16th birthday in front of the dry goods store on Walnut Street, the one year her father had remembered to send money for anything at all. She stood holding that photograph for a long time. The house was very quiet, and outside the wind moved through the grass with a sound like distant conversation, and Maria thought that if she had expected to feel one clean, simple emotion about all of this, she had been wrong. What she felt was tangled and several layers deep and resistant to any easy name. She was still standing in the house holding the photograph when she heard horses. She stepped out onto the porch and saw a rider coming from the south, moving at an easy trot along the fence line she had noted was well maintained and clearly not original to the property. The rider was a man, and as he came closer she could see he was perhaps 30 or 31, with dark hair under a battered hat, broad shoulders in a canvas work coat, and the unhurried posture of someone who had spent his entire life on horseback. He pulled up at the gate and looked at her steadily, and she looked back at him with equal directness, and for a moment neither of them said anything. His eyes were dark brown and there was nothing calculating in them. He simply looked at her the way you look at something you want to understand. "Miss Redmond," he said. It was not a question. "Mr. Brooks," she replied with the same certainty. He dismounted and looped his reins over the fence post and walked to the gate. He was taller than she had expected, though she was not sure why she had formed an expectation at all. He took his hat off when he reached the porch, which was a piece of courtesy she had not been entirely sure she would encounter in the territory, and he said, "I saw the horse at the fence. I wanted to make sure everything was all right." "It is," she said. "Thank you." He looked at the house, then back at her. "I am sorry about your father. You knew him better than I did," she said, and immediately felt the sharpness of the words, though she had not entirely meant them to come out sharp. She tried again. "I only mean that you clearly spent more time with him these past years than I was able to." "He was a man who needed a neighbor," Brooks said simply, as though that explained everything and required no further elaboration. He was looking at her with that same steady attention, and she had the particular discomfort of feeling as though she were being assessed not unkindly, but very honestly. "Did you find everything in order inside?" "As well as one could expect," she said. "I found that you have been maintaining the fence line on the south side. It needed doing. Mr. Brooks." She stepped off the porch so she was on the same level as him, because she had found over the years that conversations conducted from elevated ground tended to be misinterpreted as condescension even when they were not. "I have spoken to Sheriff Prout. I know what you spent on this property and what you did for my father. I intend to repay you." He shook his head once, a short, decided motion. "I did not do those things on credit. Nevertheless, you are owed something. Miss Redmond." He said her name quietly, and the way he said it was not dismissive but rather clarifying, as though he were placing a thought precisely where he wanted it. "Your father was a man who lived in the house next to mine and needed help from time to time. I gave it because that is what you do. There is no debt between neighbors." "My father was not a good neighbor," she said plainly. "He borrowed and did not return. He let his fences fail and his animals stray. He was charming and meant well, and delivered almost nothing he promised. I know this because he did the same thing to my mother and me for 26 years. She heard herself say it and was mildly surprised by her own directness, but she was tired of prettying up the portrait of Thomas Redmond for the comfort of polite conversation. "You were a better neighbor to him than he was to you, and a better custodian of this land than he ever managed to be, and I think you deserve to be acknowledged for that, if nothing else." Gilbert Brooks was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with an expression she could not immediately name. Then he said, "Prout told me you were direct. Is that a complaint?" "No," he said, and for the first time there was the suggestion of something like humor in his eyes. "It is just about the most refreshing thing I have heard in several months." She did not quite smile, but she felt the tension in her shoulders ease just slightly, and they stood in the autumn light for a moment with the wind moving through the grass around them and the mountains enormous and purple to the west. And it was, Maria thought, a genuinely strange situation, standing on her dead father's land talking to the man who had cared for it, and yet it did not feel wrong. It felt, in a way she did not yet know how to articulate, like the beginning of something that made more sense than a great many other things in her recent experience. "I need to understand the full picture of this property," she said eventually, because business was a reliable platform when everything else felt uncertain. "What it is worth, what its condition is, what would be required to make it viable. Would you be willing to show me around it? You know it better than I do." "I can do that," he said. "Tomorrow, if you like, if you are free in the morning." "I am free in the morning," she said. He put his hat back on, nodded once, and went back to his horse. He mounted easily, the way a man mounts who has done it 10,000 times and does not think about it anymore, and he turned his horse south. He was perhaps 20 yards away when he paused and looked back at her over his shoulder. "Miss Redmond," he said, "your father talked about you, more than you might think." Then he rode south along the fence line and was gone, and Maria stood on the porch of her father's house and felt something complicated loosen slightly in her chest, like a knot that has been tight for a very long time giving just 1 degree of slack. The next morning arrived cold and clear, the sky an unblemished vault of blue, and Maria was at the Redmond property by 9 o'clock. Gilbert Brooks arrived at 5 minutes past, leading a second horse in addition to his own, a brown gelding with a sensible eye, because she had mentioned the mare she had rented, and apparently he had silently concluded that a reliable working horse was more appropriate for a property tour than a livery rental. "That was thoughtful," she said, assessing the gelding. "His name is Copper," Brooks said. "He will not give you any trouble." He was right. Copper was steady and responsive, and Maria had ridden all her life, having grown up in a household that kept a horse even during their leaner years, and she fell into the saddle with easy confidence that she noticed, in a brief sideways glance, Brooks register and apparently approve of. They spent 3 hours riding the property. Brooks knew every corner of it with the precision of someone who has walked the same ground repeatedly over years, not out of habit but out of genuine attention. He showed her where the water rights were, where the spring ran, where the soil was richest, where the fence needed continued maintenance, and where a dry arroyo cut across the southeastern corner that would occasionally flood in summer rains and required awareness when driving cattle. He explained it all with the same concise clarity with which he seemed to approach most things, without embellishment, without making it more complicated than it was, but also without glossing over the parts that would require work. If the house were properly repaired and the barn brought back to use, it would run about 40 head comfortably, he said, reining in at a slight rise that gave a view south over both the Redmond land and the beginning of the Rocking Bee, more if you expanded the water access. "Do you think it is worth keeping?" Maria asked. He looked at the land. "It is good land," he said. "It would be a waste to sell it." "That is not quite what I asked." He turned his head slightly and looked at her with those direct brown eyes. "Whether it is worth keeping depends on what you intend to do with your life," he said. "That is not something I know." "I do not know either," she said honestly. "I came out here expecting to find a disaster and sell whatever could be sold and go back to Cincinnati, but this is not quite the disaster I expected." "What is Cincinnati?" he asked, and the way he asked it was not dismissive but genuinely curious, as though Cincinnati were a country he had heard of but not visited. "It is where I live," she said. "I help my mother run a dry goods store. It is steady work and I am good at it, and it is not especially interesting." She paused. "I have never seen mountains like these before." He looked westward, where the mountains were bright in the morning sun, their lower slopes dark with juniper, and their upper reaches rocky and pale. "I grew up in Missouri," he said. "When I came out here, I was 21. I saw those mountains the first morning I was in the territory, and I knew I was not going back east." "How long have you had the Rocking Bee?" 6 years. I bought it with money I saved working another man's ranch for 5 years before that." He said it without particular pride, just as the shape of what had happened, and Maria found this quality in him consistently interesting, the way he stated things as they were without either apology or self-congratulation. They rode back toward the house, and he pointed out the fence sections he had replaced, showing her the new posts, pale yellow wood against the older weathered gray, and the neat double wire stringing that was very different from the sagging original work. 3 years of intermittent labor, she could see it in the careful joins and the even spacing, done by a man who had no obligation to do it and had done it anyway. "Why?" she asked as they came back to the gate. He knew what she was asking without further context. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Because bad fences cause trouble for everyone," he said at last. "And because your father was a man who could not quite manage things on his own and was too proud to ask for help directly, and I found it easier to simply do the work than to watch things fall to pieces. And the doctor bill when he was sick. He was dying," Brooks said, with a simplicity that was not harsh but very plain. "You do not let a man die for the want of a doctor because he does not have money." Maria looked at him for a long moment. "You are going to make it very difficult for me to feel as angry about all of this as I want to feel," she said. He looked startled for a moment, which was the first time she had seen anything like surprise cross his face, and then that suggestion of humor appeared again. "You are angry at my father," she said, "for leaving, for not writing, for letting his land and his affairs fall into the hands of a stranger who had to care for them because he could not manage to, for dying without ever quite fixing any of the things he broke." She took a breath. "And then I come here and find that a man I have never met has been doing all the things my father should have done, and doing them well, and expecting nothing in return, and it makes the anger at my father a great deal more complicated, because it also makes me feel something like gratitude, and I find it very confusing to feel both those things at once." Gilbert Brooks sat on his horse and looked at her steadily for a moment that felt longer than it was. "That seems like a reasonable thing to feel," he said at last. "Does it?" "You are grieving a man you already lost a long time ago," he said. "And you came out here to settle his affairs and instead found that someone else already did it, which makes the grief and the anger both harder and easier at the same time." He paused. "I am sorry I am making it more complicated." "You are not making it complicated," she said. "You are the least complicated part of any of this." He said nothing to that, but something in the lines of his face shifted, a softening that was very slight but real, and Maria filed it away in the same place she had been filing all her impressions of him since the previous afternoon, which was a place that was getting somewhat crowded. She stayed in Harlow Creek. She had told herself she would stay a week, perhaps two, long enough to understand the property and make a decision about it. But days passed with the particular quality of days that feel necessary rather than merely consecutive, and she found herself not ready to make a final decision, not because she was avoiding it, but because each day produced new information that complicated the previous day's conclusions. She went to see the land office and had a conversation with the land agent, a young man named Walter Birch, who had come out from Tennessee 3 years ago and was still learning the territory with the earnest diligence of someone determined to do their job properly. He confirmed that the deed was clean and in good order, that the water rights were secure, and that land in this part of the territory had been steadily increasing in value as more homesteaders came in along the railroad route. She had dinner one evening with Widow Caldwell, whose real name was Edith Perkins, and her husband Frank, who was a quiet man with a neat beard who farmed a few acres east of town, and seemed to regard his wife's animated conversation style with affectionate patience. Edith talked about the town, the people in it, the gradual changes of the past decade, and about Gilbert Brooks with the particular warmth of someone who has observed a person over years and formed a genuine respect for them. "He came here at 21 with almost nothing," Edith said, setting a dish of potatoes on the table with the confident hospitality of a woman who has fed many people in her life. "He worked for Dan Hargrove on the big spread south of town for 5 years, and every person who worked for Hargrove will tell you that Brooks was the most reliable hand he ever had. Hargrove offered to make him foreman, but Brooks wanted his own place. So he saved every cent, bought the rocking bee when old Marcus Ray's decided he was too old for it, and has built it into something real in 6 years." She paused to refill Maria's coffee cup. "He is a private man, not unfriendly but reserved. He does not talk much about himself." "I have noticed that," Maria said. "He is fair to his men and he knows cattle and he keeps his word," Edith said simply. "Out here, those three things are worth about as much as anything else." Maria rode out to the rocking bee the following afternoon, not by prior arrangement, but because she had been thinking about it all morning, and decided that continuing to think about it was less useful than simply going. She was met at the gate by one of Brooks's hands, a weathered young man named Pete who was approximately 19, and regarding her with the combined embarrassment and eagerness of a young man who does not see many women on a regular basis. Pete told her Mr. Brooks was in the south pasture working on a loading chute and offered to take her out there. She found him with his sleeves rolled up and a hammer in his hand, rebuilding the bottom section of a chute used for loading cattle into railroad cars. He was working alongside another hand, an older man named Ruiz who had a quiet efficiency and excellent carpentry instincts, and the two of them had the easy rhythm of people who have worked together long enough to know what the other one is going to do next. Brooks looked up when she rode in, and there was something in his eyes for just a moment, something warm and quick, before he set the hammer down and wiped his hands on his work pants. "Miss Redmond," he said, "I did not expect you today. I hope I am not interrupting." "We were about done for the afternoon," he said, and this was not quite true. She could see the half-finished section of chute clearly, but she also knew when a man was exercising the kind of social courtesy that involves rearranging the truth slightly to accommodate a welcome visitor. Ruiz took the horses with a nod and wandered diplomatically toward the barn, and Brooks walked with her toward the house. The rocking bee house was not large, but it was solid and well kept, built of adobe with a plank porch along the front, similar to the Redmond property but in considerably better repair. There were flowers planted along the porch railing, which surprised her. "Did you plant those?" she asked. He looked at the flowers, which were late season and mostly done but still held a few pale blossoms. "My mother sent seed packets with the first and only letter she managed to get to me after I came out here," he said. "She said there was no excuse for a man not to have something green near his house. She sounds sensible." "She was the most sensible person I have ever known," he said, and the past tense was quiet but present. "She died 4 years ago, back in Missouri." "I am sorry," Maria said. It was what one said, but she meant it, and from the way he acknowledged it with a brief nod she thought he understood the distinction. He made coffee on the kitchen stove, good strong coffee that he poured into plain white cups without apology or ceremony, and they sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon light and talked for 2 hours about things that ranged from the practical to the considerably less so. She asked him about cattle ranching, and he explained it with the patience of someone who genuinely likes the subject. She told him about Cincinnati, about the store, about her mother's capability and steady character, about growing up in a house shaped by the absence of a man who was physically gone and emotionally present as a kind of permanent, unresolved question. He listened with the focused attention she had already noted as one of his distinctive qualities, the kind of listening that makes a person feel that what they are saying matters. He told her about Missouri, about his own father, who had been a decent man but not a prosperous one, who had farmed a small piece of land with more effort than luck, and about the decision to go west that had felt at 21 like the only natural conclusion to the life he had been living. He told her about the first years out here, the learning curve of cattle and territory, and weather, the loneliness that was real but not oppressive, the gradual understanding that this land was where he was supposed to be. "Do you not get lonely here?" she asked. "The ranch is beautiful, but it is also very isolated." He considered the question with the same seriousness he seemed to give everything. "I did in the first years," he said. "Less now. I have good men and good work and enough to keep my mind occupied. But yes," he paused, "there are evenings." She understood what that meant, and she thought that she understood it in a parallel way, that there were evenings in Cincinnati above the dry goods store on Walnut Street when her life, which was perfectly adequate by most measures, felt like a very small room. On the way back to town, she stopped at her father's house and sat on the porch in the late light and thought about what she was doing. She was thinking about a man she had known for 4 days, and she was aware that the trajectory of her thoughts was not strictly practical. She was also aware, with the clear-eyed self-knowledge of a 26-year-old woman who has spent considerable time inside her own head, that what she was feeling was not merely admiration for a person of good character, though that was genuinely present. It was something warmer and more disruptive than admiration. She went back to the Palmer house and wrote a long letter to her mother, describing the property and the situation with its debts and the land's potential value. She described the town and the people she had met and the landscape, which she tried to capture in words and found was only partially possible. She wrote about Gilbert Brooks carefully, neutrally, as though she were writing a business description, and then she looked at what she had written and was amused to notice that even described carefully and neutrally, he still came out sounding like someone remarkable. She wrote at the end, "I may need a few more weeks to fully resolve the question of the property. I hope you can manage the store without me a while longer. Give my love to Mrs. Harrison next door." She sealed the letter and went to sleep and dreamed of mountains. Over the following week, a pattern established itself. She would work in the mornings at the land and the house, assessing what repairs would be required, talking to the people in town who had knowledge of the territory. And in the afternoons, she found reasons to be in the vicinity of the Rocking Bee, or Brooks found reasons to be in the vicinity of the Redmond property. And neither of them commented on the pattern, but both of them were aware of it. He was helping her fix a section of roof on the small barn one afternoon, the two of them working in the easy companionship that develops between people who are comfortable with silence, when he said, without preamble or particular change of tone, What would you do with the land if you kept it? She was handing up boards from below, and she passed one up and thought about the question. I'm not sure I know how to run a ranch, she said. That is not what I asked. No, she agreed. If I kept it, I would repair the house and the barn properly. I would bring in some cattle, probably start small. I would fix the fencing where it needs it, improve the water access the way you described. I would try to build it into something that actually works rather than something that just about survives. She paused. I am describing something I do not have the experience for. Experience can be acquired, he said from above her, and there was something in the tone of it that made her look up, but his face was concentrated on the board he was nailing and she could not read his expression. Are you suggesting something specific? She asked. He finished the nail and looked down at her. I am suggesting that there are people in this valley who know cattle and land and could help you learn, he said, if you were interested in staying. That is a significant change of life, she said. Most worthwhile ones are, he replied. She thought about that for the rest of the day. The Saturday market in Harlow Creek was a small affair by city standards. A few wagons and a half-dozen vendors set up along the main street, selling produce and goods that could not be found every day in the general store. Maria had been told about it by Edith Perkins, and had come partly out of curiosity, and partly because she needed lamp oil and some basic provisions for the hours she was spending at her father's house. She found Brooks there unexpectedly, which was to say she was aware on some level that he came to town on Saturdays, and therefore his presence was not truly unexpected. But finding him at a particular moment in a particular conversation still produced a small, involuntary alteration in the quality of the morning. He was talking to a man named Sergeant Reyes, who was Ruiz's brother and who ran a small vegetable farm on the northern edge of the valley. And when he saw Maria, he finished the conversation and came to find her with the directness he brought to everything. They walked the length of the market together without particularly planning to, and she bought her lamp oil and a bag of dried beans and a small jar of honey that the vendor, an elderly woman with fierce gray braids, pressed on her with such insistence that refusing would have been impolite. Brooks bought nothing, but he walked beside her with the comfortable ease of someone who simply wants to be where he is. I have been thinking about what you said, Maria told him, between the honey vendor and the man selling rope. About staying. I did not precisely say you should stay, he said. No, but you implied it fairly strongly. I implied that experience can be acquired if a person is interested in acquiring it, he said. That is not the same as telling you what to do. No, she said. It is more subtle than that. She glanced at him. I suspect you are often more subtle than you appear to be. I appear entirely straightforward, he said, with a gravity that was not quite serious. You appear straightforward, she agreed. But you make observations at moments when they will have the maximum possible effect on a person's thinking, and that is a form of subtlety. He was quiet for a moment. Would you like some coffee? He said. She laughed. It came out of her before she could manage it, which was not a thing that happened to her frequently. A genuine laugh of the kind that arrives without permission. And he looked at her with an expression that was openly warm for perhaps the first time since she had met him. Not the careful warmth of someone being polite, but the simple human warmth of someone who is pleased by something. They had coffee at the small establishment beside the general store that was not quite a restaurant, but served coffee and biscuits on weekday mornings, and sometimes Saturdays as a concession to the market crowd. They sat across from each other at a small table near the window, and the conversation moved in the way conversations move when two people are past the stage of careful presentation and into the stage of genuine exchange. She asked him things she had been wanting to ask, and he answered them honestly, which was a quality she was beginning to understand was fundamental to him in a way that not everyone managed. She told him about the things she was finding in her father's house that were making the whole experience more complicated. The photographs, a small pile of letters her father had apparently started writing but never sent, a journal that she had not yet had the nerve to read completely, and the general evidence that Thomas Redmond had spent his last years in a kind of suspended intention, meaning to do things, meaning to write, meaning to return, never quite managing it. "Did you read the letters?" Brooks asked. "A few of them," she said. "They were addressed to me and to my mother." He was always beginning them with news about the land and the weather, and then the news would trail off and the letter would not be finished. She looked at her coffee cup. In one of them he wrote that he would come back when he had made something worth coming back with. He never made enough. "He told me about you once," Brooks said. "We were working on a fence together, and he talked about you for half an hour. He said you were the sharpest person he had ever known and the most likely of anyone in the family to actually do something with a life. He said that. He said it clearly and completely, which was more than he managed with most subjects." Brooks paused. "He was proud of you." He did not know how to express it in any way that was useful, but the pride was real. Maria absorbed this. It did not fix anything, but it sat in a different place than the simple story of abandonment, and she was finding that all the things she was learning about her father here were not erasing her grief or her anger, but they were making both more three-dimensional, more honest, and in a strange way more bearable. "Thank you for telling me that," she said. "It is true," he said simply. After the market they walked back toward the livery in the easy October afternoon, and the conversation quieted naturally into comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have established something between them, and Maria was aware that whatever that something was, it had been building steadily since the moment she had stepped off the porch of her father's house and found him at the gate, hat in hand, looking at her with those honest brown eyes. At the livery he helped her saddle Josephine, not because she needed help but because he was there and it was something to do together. And when she was mounted and he was standing at the horse's head looking up at her, she said, "I have decided to stay through November." He looked up at her steadily. "Is that a decision about the land?" "Among other things," she said, and then she touched her heels to Josephine's sides before she could see precisely what happened to his face, though she had a reasonable idea. November in New Mexico territory was cold in the mornings and frequently warm by midday, with afternoons that held a copper-colored light, unlike anything she had seen before. Maria hired a carpenter from town named Douglas, a methodical man who charged fair rates and did excellent work, and set him to repairing the house in earnest. She bought lumber and supplies at Henry Marsh's store, and Marsh gave her a good rate with the contained satisfaction of a man who was both conducting profitable business and watching a good outcome unfold. She learned, with considerable help from Brooks and from Ruiz and from Pete, who turned out to have a gift for explaining cattle without condescension, the basic elements of running a small operation. She learned what to look for in good cattle and what to look for in bad ones. She learned the specific characteristics of this valley's grazing and water and weather patterns. She spent long mornings on horseback covering the property from corner to corner until she knew it the way she knew the floor plan of the store on Walnut Street. Brooks came over most days on some legitimate pretext, and she went to the rocking bee most days on some equally legitimate pretext. And between the legitimate pretexts, there was an increasing quantity of time that was simply time spent together, talking and not talking, working and not working, in the particular close orbit of two people who have found each other worth the proximity. He was patient with her ignorance about cattle and land in a way that was not condescending, because it was rooted in genuine respect for her intelligence, a respect that was evident in the way he explained things once completely rather than repeatedly and simply, assuming she had understood because she had. He asked her opinion on the house repairs and found that she had sound practical instincts about structure and space. He told her one afternoon that she had an excellent eye for what was worth fixing and what should simply be replaced, and she had recognized this as both a practical observation and a compliment that operated on more than one level. She wrote her mother long letters, longer than usual, and her mother wrote back with the precision of a woman who had always read between lines and knew exactly when her daughter was telling a story and when she was living one. Clara Redmond's letters were warm and contained no pressure and asked only the questions that needed asking. She asked about the land value and the costs and the logistics. She did not ask about Gilbert Brooks by name, but she asked whether Maria had found good people in the territory, and said that good people were more valuable than good land, which was possibly the most direct statement of opinion she had ever offered Maria in writing. One evening in the second week of November, Brooks came to the Redmond property at sundown with no particular pretext at all, just came to the gate as she was finishing for the day and said, "Come and see the view from the South Ridge. It is something, this time of year." She went without argument. They rode up the rise that marked the border between the two properties and came out on a long flat ridge that faced west, and the sky was doing something extraordinary. A sunset that involved 3 different shades of orange and a gold that was almost painful and a deep violet at the upper edges, and the mountains were black against it, and the valley below them was purple in the failing light. She did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would improve the situation. After a while he said quietly, "I think about you when you are not here." She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains, and his profile was clear in the last light, and she thought that there were very few people in her life who had managed to say the most important thing in the simplest possible words. "I think about you as well," she said, "considerably more than is probably sensible." He turned then, and looked at her in the way he looked at everything he wanted to understand fully, and she met his eyes with the directness that was as natural to her as breathing. "I realize I am not a simple situation," she said. "I'm a woman who arrived here a month ago to settle a dead man's affairs and does not know yet whether she will stay. That is not a simple situation to become involved with." "No," he agreed, "but you are the least simple person I have ever met, and I find that extremely interesting." She felt something warm and genuine rise in her chest, and she said, "Mr. Brooks." "Gilbert," he said, quietly but decisively. "Gilbert," she repeated, and the name sat correctly in her mouth as though she had been saying it for years. "I am going to stay." He looked at her steadily. On the land," she said, "and whatever follows from that." Whatever follows from that was a phrase that contained considerable territory, and both of them understood its scope, and the mountain sunset was finishing itself in elaborate color around them. And Gilbert Brooks reached across and took her hand in his work-roughened one, with the same directness he brought to all practical necessities, and Maria Redmond did not pull away. The weeks that followed were the busiest and most alive she could remember. Douglas finished the main repairs on the house, and she moved into it in mid-November, which produced mild scandal at the Palmer house and mild approval from Edith Perkins, who said that a woman taking up her own property was a sensible thing to do, and if people wanted to discuss it, they were welcome to. Maria had brought her carpet-bag and her trunk from the hotel and set them down in her father's house, and looked around at the repaired roof, and the clean floors, and the window glass that Douglas had replaced, and felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled for a long time. She bought 6 head of cattle from a man named Thornton on the east side of the valley, who was reducing his herd before winter, a modest beginning but a real one, and Ruiz helped her settle them on the grass by the spring and confirmed that they were in good health. She ordered a proper wood stove from Marsh's general store, a better one than the battered original, and Gilbert helped her install it on a cold afternoon when both of them were pink-cheeked from the cold and the work. And when they were done and the fire was lit and the stove was heating the small kitchen, he stood in her kitchen and said, "You are going to do very well here." "I am going to do adequately to begin with," she said, pouring coffee from the pot she had set on the new stove's burner, "and I am going to do very well eventually." "That is precisely what I said," he replied, and when she looked up at him there was such uncomplicated warmth in his expression that she set the coffee down and crossed the kitchen and kissed him. It was not a planned moment, Or rather, it was planned only in the sense that it had been building toward this point for weeks, and she had simply arrived there before propriety had a chance to intervene. He did not seem displeased by this approach. He kissed her back with the same quality he brought to everything, complete and unhurried and entirely present. And the kitchen was warm and the stove was ticking with heat, and outside the wind was cold on the valley. When she stepped back, he was looking at her with the expression she had begun to recognize as his equivalent of a person who is extremely happy and does not yet know exactly what to do with it. "I should say something now, I think," he said. "You do not need to," she said, "but you may. I have not been able to think about anything else since the day you rode up to your father's gate and looked at me like I was something that needed to be understood," he said. "I want you to know that. I did need to understand you," she said, "and have you, most of you," she said. "I suspect the rest will take considerably more time." "How long?" he asked, and the question was quiet but not casual. She looked at him steadily with the full attention of a woman who has spent her whole life being careful and has decided that careful is not always the most honest approach. "As long as it takes," she said, "which could be a very long time." He smiled then, fully, which was not something she had seen before, a real smile that changed his whole face and was nothing like the careful, suggested humor she had been cataloging, and she thought she would like to be the reason for that smile as frequently as possible. They were careful with each other in the ways that the territory and the time required. Maria's reputation in Harlow Creek was a practical matter, and she understood that. They were seen together frequently, which everyone who paid attention understood to mean something, and Edith Perkins managed the social narrative with the confident efficiency of a woman who has always known that gossip, properly handled, is simply information traveling at speed. The formal beginning came in December, which in the territory was cold but often clear, and Gilbert came to her house on a Sunday afternoon with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is now doubting whether the rehearsal was sufficient. And he asked her to marry him with the same directness he brought to everything, except that his voice was slightly less steady than usual, which she found so touching that she answered him before he had finished the question. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He let out a breath. "I had more to say." "You can say it anyway," she said. "I was going to say that I know this is not how a woman is supposed to find herself engaged, arriving to settle a dead man's affairs and somehow staying on and deciding to build something here," he said. "I know it is not conventional, and I want you to know that I understand if you need to go back to Cincinnati first, to settle your own affairs and tell your mother and do it properly. I'm not asking you to disappear." "My mother," Maria said, "will be on the first train west that can be arranged." He looked at her. "You are certain?" "Gilbert," she said gently, "I have been certain for weeks. I was simply taking the appropriate amount of time." She wrote to Clara Redmond that evening, a letter that was 5 pages long and left nothing out, neither the practical facts nor the personal ones. She described the land and its potential, and the repairs she had made and the cattle she had bought, and the stove that heated the kitchen properly. And then she described Gilbert Brooks with the full accuracy she had been reserving, his patience and his directness and his particular quality of steadiness, the way he had cared for her father's land not out of obligation, but out of simple decency, the way he had looked at her from the beginning as though she were someone worth looking at. Her mother's reply came 3 weeks later, which was as fast as the mail could manage, and it was 2 pages of practical questions answered by Clara Redmond's characteristic efficient warmth, followed by a single paragraph that said, "I have met very few men who deserve a good woman's trust, and I have met even fewer who earn it by quietly doing the right thing when no one is watching. You are more perceptive than your father ever was, and I trust you. Come home in the spring and bring him with you so I can look at him myself, and then come back to your land and your life and be happy. You have waited long enough for a life that fits you." Maria read this paragraph twice, and then folded the letter very carefully and set it on the shelf where her father had kept his own letters, and was quiet for a moment in the way you are quiet when something has been given to you that you did not know you needed. Christmas in Harlow Creek was a modest and genuine affair. The church held a service, and the town gathered with the particular communal warmth of a small settlement that understands its own importance to its members. Maria attended with Gilbert, which formalized in public what had been established in private, and no one in Harlow Creek seemed to find this surprising or objectionable. With the exception of a man named Aldous Crane, who had a small farm east of town, and held opinions about women conducting their own property affairs, that Maria addressed so efficiently and directly at the general store, on the occasion of their meeting that Marsh later said it was the most effectively concluded argument he had ever witnessed, and he had been watching arguments in that store for 12 years. Gilbert gave her a leather-bound journal for Christmas, good quality, with blank pages, and he said, "You observe things that deserve to be written down." She gave him a new hat, because his current one was in a condition that she had been eyeing with mild horror for weeks, a proper cattleman's hat in dark felt that she had ordered from the merchant in the next town at considerable trouble. And when he put it on, she was pleased to see it suited him in the exact way she had calculated it would. They planned the wedding for March, which would give time for the roads to be reliable and for Clara Redmond to make the journey from Cincinnati, which she had confirmed she fully intended to do. January and February passed with the particular quality of a hard winter that is also somehow one of the best periods of a person's life. The cold was genuine, and Maria learned about wood stoves and water that froze in pipes and cattle that needed extra feeding in deep cold, and she learned all of it with the application she brought to every new thing, making mistakes and correcting them and building the knowledge into herself until it was solid. Gilbert was at the Redmond property, or she was at the Rocking Bee most days, and on the days when weather kept them on their own properties, there was a sense of incompleteness that was not distress but simply awareness, the way a person becomes aware of a particular sound by its absence. On the days when weather cleared and she rode south along the fence line to the Rocking Bee gate, and he came out of the barn or the house to meet her, something in the whole landscape felt correct. He taught her things she did not know and learned from her things she knew that he did not, and the exchange was genuinely reciprocal, which she appreciated with a depth that had to do with 26 years of being in the company of people who recognized her capability without always knowing quite what to do with it. Gilbert did not seem to have this problem. He treated her judgment as something useful and her opinion as something worth considering, and when he disagreed with her, he said so directly and without apology, and when she disagreed with him, she did the same, and they found that they could argue about practical matters with heat and efficiency, and come out the other side of the argument having made a better decision than either of them would have reached alone. There was one difficult week in late January when a disagreement about the expansion of the water access on her property became a larger argument than it needed to be, rooted in the fact that she had consulted a man at the land office without telling Gilbert first, and he had interpreted this as a sign of doubt, and she had interpreted his interpretation as a sign of exactly the controlling tendency she had feared finding in him. They did not speak for 2 days, which was 2 days of very cold air with a secondary source beyond the weather, and on the 3rd day she rode to the Rocking Bee in the morning and found him at the corral with Copper and waited until he saw her. He came to the fence and looked at her and said, "I was wrong to take it personally. I should have told you what I was planning," she said, "not because I need permission but because we are a partnership and partnerships require communication." "Yes," he said, "but if you ever treat my decisions as though they require your approval simply because they are mine," she said carefully, "I will tell you so directly." "I know you will," he said. "That is one of the things I am most glad about." She dismounted, and they stood at the corral fence in the January cold, and she thought that the ability to argue and resolve and come back was possibly the most important thing she had seen in him, more important even than all the patient fencing and roof repairs and unpaid doctor bills, because all of that was about who he was when he was alone, and this was about who he was with her. Clara Redmond arrived in the second week of March, stepping off the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe at Harlow Creek Station, with the same trunk her daughter had arrived with 4 months earlier, and a particular expression that combined exhaustion from a very long train journey with the alert assessment of a woman who intends to see everything clearly. Maria was there to meet her, and they embraced on the platform with the contained emotion of women who love each other well and have not seen each other for 4 months that had been quite full, and Clara held her daughter at arm's length and looked at her and said, "You look different." "I have been working outdoors," Maria said. "It is not the outdoors," Clara said, with the accuracy of a mother who has been reading her daughter's face for 26 years. Gilbert was waiting with the horses at the edge of the station yard, not wishing to impose himself on the first moments, and when Maria brought her mother to him, he took his hat off and said, "Mrs. Redmond, it is a pleasure to finally meet you. Your daughter has spoken very highly of you." Clara looked at him with the comprehensive appraisal she had prepared on the train from Cincinnati, and after a moment she said, "She has spoken very highly of you as well. I intend to spend several days forming my own opinion." "I would expect nothing less," he said, which was precisely the right answer. Clara Redmond spent 5 days in Harlow Creek. She stayed at the Palmer house because Maria's house was not yet ready for 2 guests, though Maria had made the repairs and furnished it well enough that it was genuinely comfortable for 1 person. Clara visited the property and walked through it with the methodical attention she brought to all spaces, assessing the repairs and the quality of the work, and the layout of the land from the particular perspective of a woman who had been running a commercial establishment for over a decade and had practical understanding of what a working property required. She had coffee with Gilbert at the kitchen table on the second morning, just the 2 of them, which Maria had been told about afterward by both participants with different but not contradictory accounts. Clara had asked him direct questions about his history and his finances and his intentions and his opinions on a variety of subjects, and he had answered everything honestly and completely, and at the end she had said, "You fixed her father's fence." "It needed fixing," he had said. "You did it for 3 years," Clara said, "and you paid his debts and took him to the doctor and never asked for anything back. He was my neighbor." "He was a difficult man and a neglectful one, and he owed you considerably," Clara said, "and you chose to see him as your neighbor and treat him accordingly." She had paused. "My daughter is not a sentimental person, Mr. Brooks, but she recognizes quality when she meets it, and she does not make important decisions carelessly. The fact that she is here and that she looks the way she looks tells me everything I need to know about whether she has made a good decision." He had apparently said, "She has made her own decision, Mrs. Redmond. She always does." And Clara had smiled, which Maria said was not a common enough occurrence for it to be treated as anything other than significant. On the last evening before Clara returned to Cincinnati, she and Maria sat together in Maria's kitchen after Gilbert had gone home, and Clara looked around the repaired house with its good new stove and its clean floors and the late-season light coming through the windows, and she said, "Your father meant to do something with this place." "I know," Maria said. "He just never quite managed it," Clara said. "No, you have," Clara said. "And you found a good man and you will build something real here." She folded her hands in her lap with her characteristic composure, and then she said something Maria had not expected. "I should not have been so bitter about him. Your father. He was not a bad man. He was simply a man who could not quite close the distance between what he intended and what he did." She was quiet for a moment. "Gilbert Brooks does not have that problem." "No," Maria agreed. "He very much does not." "Good," said Clara Redmond with finality. "Then let us have a wedding." The wedding was held on a Saturday in late March, in the church with the peeling white paint that someone had freshly repainted for the occasion, which turned out to be Edith Perkins, who had organized a painting party the previous weekend, with the cheerful authority of a woman who sees what needs doing and simply does it. The pews were full of the people of Harlow Creek, because a town of this size does not have many occasions for celebration and takes all available ones seriously. Maria wore a dress her mother had brought from Cincinnati, a deep blue wool that was not a traditional wedding color but suited her exactly, and which Gilbert looked at when she walked into the church with an expression that required no interpretation whatsoever. The minister was a young man named Reverend Cole, who had been in Harlow Creek for 2 years and had married a number of couples and buried a fair number of people, and was developing the kind of pastoral wisdom that comes from paying close attention. He performed the ceremony with warmth and efficiency and considerable feeling, and the words he said were the traditional ones, but he said them as though he meant them on behalf of the specific couple in front of him. When Gilbert said, "I do," he said it looking directly at her, with the full steadiness of his character behind it. And when Maria said, "I do," she said it with the quiet completeness of a woman who has made a decision she has examined from every angle and found it sound. Clara Redmond sat in the first pew with Edith Perkins and Frank and Sheriff Prout, and several other people who had become part of Maria's world in 4 months, and she did not cry, which was consistent with her character, but she pressed her handkerchief to the corner of her eye once, with the precision of a woman managing an emotion she has decided to contain. Ruiz played the guitar afterward in the church yard, in the warm March afternoon, and Pete danced badly and enthusiastically with whichever young woman would accept him, which turned out to be Thornton's eldest daughter, a cheerful girl named Beatrice who was apparently not particular about good dancing as long as there was energy behind it. Henry Marsh brought out a cake, a real one, because Marsh's wife was known in Harlow Creek for her baking as a man is known for his trade, and the cake was excellent. Maria danced with Gilbert in the churchyard in the afternoon sun, and he danced with the same quality as everything else he did, not perfectly but genuinely. And she thought that a life with a man who does everything genuinely was a life she could inhabit completely. Clara left on Tuesday morning, and the farewell on the station platform was longer than the greeting had been. 4 months of filling in had restored something between them that had thinned during Maria's absence, and Clara held her daughter and said quietly, "Come back when you can, and bring him when you do." Then she looked at Gilbert and said, "You take care of my daughter," and he said, "She is more than capable of taking care of herself," and Clara's expression was precisely what it should have been. The train pulled out and Maria stood watching it until it was gone, and then Gilbert put his hand at the small of her back and they turned toward the horses and the road home. Home was both properties now, in the practical sense that they spent time at both and managed both together, but in the deeper sense, it was the valley and the fence line, and the mountains at evening, and the mornings with the stove warm and the coffee on, and the particular quality of light that New Mexico produced in any season. Home was something Maria had not been entirely certain she had until she found it, and found it in the least expected form, 160 acres that her father had meant to build something on, and she had actually built something on, beside a man who had been quietly keeping faith with the land and the idea of it for years before she arrived. Spring came properly in April, and the valley turned green in a way that startled her because she had not quite expected the desert country to do that, to produce that specific shade of new green against the dark juniper and the pale grass, with the mountains still carrying snow at their upper reaches, and the lower slopes blooming with the small wildflowers that appeared every year like something promised and kept. She rode out in the mornings to check her cattle, who were doing well under Ruiz's patient oversight, and she felt the territory in her lungs and her muscles and her sense of direction, and she thought that a place can become part of a person quickly if the person is paying attention. She expanded the herd through the summer. She made a deal with Thornton for 12 more head, good quality, and Gilbert helped her work them into the grazing rotation, and showed her the specifics of the valley's summer dry periods and how to manage water access during them. She hired a hand of her own, a young man named Samuel who had come down from Colorado looking for work, and who had the steady, unshowy competence that she had learned to identify as the most valuable kind. The operation began to take real shape, and with it a confidence in her own knowledge that was built not on certainty but on accumulated experience, which was the only kind that actually holds. At the rocking bee, Gilbert's operation was doing well too. He had a strong year with his cattle and made a deal to supply beef to the railroad camp that was extending its lines 40 miles to the west, which was a significant contract and represented the kind of growth that required careful management. And Maria found that her background in the dry goods business, specifically her instincts for pricing and supply and the rhythm of commercial relationships, was genuinely useful to him in navigating the contract terms. They sat at the kitchen table at the rocking bee many evenings working through the numbers together, and it was not unlike the evenings she had spent with her mother at the store on Walnut Street. But it was also entirely different, and both things were true at once. She found the journal in August, the last of her father's things that she had not yet fully gone through, and she sat on the porch in the evening and read it. It was not a daily record, but more like the intermittent thoughts of a man who occasionally needed to write something down and rarely knew quite how to start. There were observations about the land and the weather. There were entries about cattle deals and fence repairs and the occasional visitor. There were several entries about Gilbert Brooks that were written with the combination of respect and mild sheepishness of a man who knew he was being outmatched in the area of basic responsibility but could not quite stop it. One entry read, "Brooks fixed the east fence again. I had told myself I would get to it in the spring, and here it is August, and he has done it himself. He does not make me feel ashamed about it. I do not know how he manages that. A better man would have learned from his example and become more like him. I have not managed that, but I think about it." Another entry later, "Maria would understand this land. She would know what to do with it. She is her mother's daughter, and her mother could run anything she put her mind to. I should write her. I will write her when I have something worth telling. I keep waiting for that." Maria closed the journal and sat for a while in the evening air while the mountains went through their colors. She thought about her father with the full, complicated, finally peaceful assessment of someone who has moved past the simple stories and found the actual man. He had been limited and well-meaning, and had loved her across a distance he never found a way to close. He had been tended in his last years by a man who asked nothing of him and expected nothing back, and his land had come to her, and she had done with it what he had hoped she might, and she thought that perhaps the best outcome of a limited life was that the people who came after it did better. She told Gilbert about the journal entry over supper, the one about the fence, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "I did not know he had written that." "Would it have changed anything?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I am glad to know it." "He saw you clearly," she said. "He just could not quite be what he saw." "A lot of people are like that," Gilbert said, not as an excuse but as a plain observation. "He was not a bad man." "No," she agreed. "He was just not quite equal to his own intentions." She sent the journal to her mother in the fall with a letter explaining what it contained and why she thought Clara should have it. Clara wrote back 3 weeks later with a letter that was shorter than usual and said simply, "Thank you. I read it. I think I have been angry for a long time, and I find I am rather tired of it. I intend to be done with that now." By the following spring, Maria was expecting their first child, and she had written to Clara with the news in March with a happiness that was straightforward and complete and required no management. Clara wrote back with advice about pregnancy that was practical and comprehensive, and covered everything from diet to the importance of finding a good doctor, which in Harlow Creek had recently become easier, as a young physician named Dr. Avery had established a proper practice in the building next to the barber shop, and was proving to be both competent and kind. Gilbert received the news with characteristic expressiveness, which is to say that he sat very still for a moment, and then looked at her with everything he felt written plainly across his face. And then he stood up from the table and put his arms around her with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with his usual economy of gesture. And she thought that the things he kept close were always the most important ones. The Redmond property and the rocking bee functioned through that spring and summer as two operations with one set of managers, and Maria worked as long as she could manage, and then worked slightly less, but not by much, because she had a stubborn relationship with inactivity. And Dr. Avery, who was pragmatic about healthy pregnant women who lived working lives, did not argue with her except about the things that genuinely required argument. Thomas Gilbert Brooks arrived in September of 1884, 3 weeks after the first anniversary of the wedding, in the repaired house on the Redmond property where Maria had decided she wanted to be for it. The birth was attended by Dr. Avery and by Edith Perkins, who had extensive practical experience with births and served with the confident efficiency of someone who has been through this enough times that she is neither frightened nor casual about it. Gilbert paced the porch for 2 hours with the sustained anxiety of a man who is entirely capable in all circumstances, except those where the person he loves most is in another room not quite in his control. And when Dr. Avery opened the door and said, "Come in," he went in with the expression of a man walking towards something that may be the best moment of his life. Thomas Gilbert Brooks was a dark-haired, healthy, thoroughly opinionated infant from his first hour, which all parties agreed was entirely predictable given his parentage. Maria held him and looked at him with the focused attention she brought to all important things, and Gilbert sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them, and there was nothing adequate to say about the specific quality of that moment, so he did not try to say it, which was, she thought, exactly right. She named him Thomas for her father, which was a decision she had arrived at slowly and carefully over the months of waiting, and Gilbert had said when she told him, "Are you sure?" And she had said, "It is not a monument to who he was. It is a way of saying that even a limited life matters to the people it touches." And Gilbert had looked at her and said, "That is a generous way to see it," and she had said, "I have had a lot of time to decide how I want to see it." Clara Redmond came west for the birth, arriving 2 weeks after Thomas was born with the timing of a grandmother, who has calculated the appropriate moment to be useful without being intrusive. And she spent 3 weeks in Harlow Creek that were among the most genuinely warm of any period Maria could remember with her mother. Clara held her grandson with the contained tenderness of a woman who has loved carefully and well for many years, and she looked across the kitchen table at Gilbert with the expression of someone completing a long assessment and finding it resolved in exactly the direction she had hoped. On her last morning, sitting at the kitchen table with Thomas asleep in his basket and the morning light coming in through the windows, Clara said to Maria quietly, "Your father would have been pleased with all of this." "I know," Maria said. "I have made my peace with him." "So have I," Clara said, finally. It took 3 more years to bring the Redmond operation to full working strength, and by the end of 1887, Maria was running a solid operation of 60 head, had hired Samuel full-time and added a second hand, and had established a grazing rotation and water management system that she had worked out in conversation with Gilbert and with the practical experience of 4 years on the land. The two properties functioned independently but in productive cooperation, sharing labor and knowledge, and the particular economies that come from 2 well-run operations working the same valley. The house had been expanded by then, a second room added when Thomas was 2, and it became clear that the original dimensions were going to be insufficient for the life being lived in them. She and Gilbert had designed the addition together, and she had contributed specific ideas about light and airflow that surprised Douglas the carpenter, who had been building houses in the territory for 15 years, and said he had not thought of the east-facing window placement that way, but she was correct. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara June after 2 women who had shaped Maria's life, arrived in the spring of 1887, and Thomas, who was 2.5 and extremely interested in everything, received his sister with the combination of fascination and mild alarm that is characteristic of toddlers encountering infants. Life in Harlow Creek continued to change. The railroad traffic increased and brought new people and new money into the territory. And the town grew, adding a hardware store and a second doctor, and a proper schoolhouse that Maria had been arguing for since 1885, and which finally materialized in 1888 through a combination of community fundraising and territorial funding that she had helped to organize with Edith Perkins and 2 other women who had identified it as necessary and simply set about making it happen. She wrote to her mother every 2 weeks, and Clara wrote back with the same regularity, and the letters were long and detailed, and full of the specific substance of 2 lives being lived well in different places. Clara sold the dry goods store in 1888 to a young couple from Pennsylvania who she said had good instincts and would take care of it. And she spent the proceeds on a trip west that lasted 2 months and included enough time with Thomas and Clara June and Gilbert, and the specific daily reality of the valley that she went home to Cincinnati, knowing the shape of her daughter's life from the inside. On the last evening of her visit, Clara Redmond sat on the porch of her daughter's house, which was no longer her daughter's house but her daughter and son-in-law's house, the house that had been Thomas Redmond's failing intention and was now Maria and Gilbert's solid fact. The mountains were doing their evening performance in the western sky, and Thomas was chasing something in the yard with the inexhaustible energy of a 4-year-old. And Clara June was in Gilbert's arms on the other end of the porch, and Gilbert was talking quietly to the baby with the ease of a man who has found that his natural directness translates unexpectedly well to conversations with small children who cannot yet answer back. Maria sat beside her mother, and they watched the evening together in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who have said everything important and have arrived at a place that requires no further explanation. "You did what I hoped you would," Clara said at last. "What is that?" "You found yourself a life that fits," her mother said. "Not a convenient one, not a careful one, the right one." Maria looked at the valley, at her land and the neighboring land and the fence line between them that was so well maintained you could barely see the seam, and at her husband with her daughter on his arm, and at her son running through the grass in the last gold of the evening light, and at the mountains beyond all of it, enormous and permanent and impossible to describe to someone who has not seen them. "I came here to settle my father's affairs," she said. "And did you?" Clara asked. "All of them," Maria said. "Every one." She had come with a carpetbag and a letter from a sheriff and a tangle of grief and anger and obligation, and she had found a fence line maintained by a man who did the right thing because it needed doing, and land that wanted tending, and a town full of people who were building something real out of hard material, and a man who had been honoring her father's obligations better than her father ever had, not because the obligations were his, but because that was the quality of the life he lived. And she had stayed, and she had built, and she had found that the life that fits is not the one you plan, but the one you recognize when you are in it. The evening settled into the valley with its copper and violet, and the mountains went dark against the sky, and Thomas came barreling across the yard and hit his father's leg and was scooped up one-handed with Clara still in the other arm. And Gilbert looked down the porch at Maria with the look she had come to know better than any landscape in her life, warm and direct and entirely certain, and she looked back at him the same way. Clara Redmond's train left the following morning, and she stood on the station platform and held her daughter for a long moment before she stepped aboard, and she said nothing because there was nothing left to say, and the train pulled out into the wide, bright morning of New Mexico territory, and Maria stood with Gilbert and Thomas, who had insisted on coming to see the train, and Clara June in her arms, and they watched until it was gone. And then they turned back toward the horses, and the road that led through the valley to the land that was theirs. Sheriff Dale Prout retired in the spring of 1889 and was given a dinner at the church hall that the whole town attended, and he made a short speech in which he mentioned several things he was glad to have seen in his years in Harlow Creek. And among them, he mentioned Maria and Gilbert Brooks and the Redmond property, not by way of sentiment, but as an example of the kind of thing that gave him faith in the general trajectory of human affairs, which was about as effusive as Dale Prout had ever been in public. Maria stood up and thanked him for everything he had done in those first weeks when she arrived, for the directness of his account of her father's debts and the honesty of his portrait of the man who had been quietly tending them, because without that honesty she might have come and gone without understanding what she had found, and everything that followed would have been different. Prout looked at her from across the church hall with his dry, weathered smile and said, "I just told you what was there, Miss Redmond." "It is Mrs. Brooks," she said, and Gilbert beside her said nothing, but she felt the warmth of it. The following years were not without difficulty, because the territory and the cattle business and the general nature of frontier life did not offer the option of a life without difficulty, and Maria would not have wanted one, because the difficulty was part of what made the life feel real and earned. There were dry summers and hard winters and cattle prices that moved in directions that required adjustment, and a summer storm in 1890 that took out a section of roof on the new addition and required immediate and expensive repair. There were disagreements and reconciliations and the ordinary serious business of two strong-minded people building a shared life, and all of it moved in the direction of something that was, assessed honestly, exceptionally good. Thomas started school in 1889 at the new schoolhouse, where he was immediately identified as both highly capable and considerably energetic, which required management by his teacher, a young woman named Miss Hargrove who had come from Texas and was equal to the challenge. Clara June followed in 1892, a quieter child than her brother but not less sharp, with a particular gift for mathematics that her parents recognized and encouraged with the specific attention that competence deserves. Maria wrote a letter in 1891 to a women's organization in Santa Fe that was working on the question of property rights for women in the territory, because the legal situation for women holding property was still uneven in ways that had direct practical impact on women she knew, and she had opinions about it that she had been forming since her first day at the land office, and which, she had decided, were worth stating in a forum where they might be useful. She received a reply from a woman named Constance Ward who ran the organization, and a correspondence began that led eventually to Maria attending a meeting in Santa Fe in 1892, which was the first time she had been to a city of any size since leaving Cincinnati, and which she found simultaneously interesting and slightly claustrophobic after 10 years in the valley. Gilbert went with her to Santa Fe, which meant leaving the properties in Ruiz's capable hands for a week and trusting Samuel with the decisions that arose, which Ruiz was entirely equal to and Samuel had grown into over the years. They stayed at a decent hotel and attended the meeting, and went to a restaurant on the second evening that was considerably more formal than anything available in Harlow Creek, and Gilbert wore his good coat and looked at the menu with the expression of a man who is culturally adaptable but has his preferences. They walked the plazas of Santa Fe in the evenings, and she looked at the city with the eyes of someone who had once lived in Cincinnati and expected to do so forever, and she felt curious about it without feeling any pull toward it. "Could you live in a city again?" he asked her one evening as they walked back to the hotel along the lamplit street. "No," she said, without hesitation. "Could you?" "Never could," he said. "Then that is settled," she said, and took his arm, and they walked back through the Santa Fe evening with the easy certainty of people who know exactly where they belong. She thought sometimes about the woman who had arrived at Harlow Creek Station in October of 1882 with a carpetbag and a trunk and a letter from a sheriff, 26 years old, and standing in the station yard looking at mountains she had never seen before. That woman had been capable and clear-eyed and considerably more wounded than she acknowledged, and she had come to settle the affairs of a man who had never quite managed to settle them himself, and she had found that the settling of affairs, when done with full attention and genuine presence, has a way of settling other things besides. She had found land that was worth keeping. She had found a town full of people who were real. She had found, in a man who had spent 3 years quietly mending her father's fence without asking anything in return, a quality of character that she had not been sure still existed in the world, the kind of goodness that operates without audience, that does the right thing because it is the right thing and for no other reason. By 1893, the valley had changed considerably, more settled, more populated, the frontier edge worn down somewhat by the years of habitation and the steady expansion of the railroad's reach. There were new families and new operations and the particular social complexity of a growing community. The church had been properly repaired and repainted, not by Edith Perkins this time, but by a committee of which Edith was the chair. There was a proper school board now, of which Maria was a member, and a town council, on which Gilbert served alongside Sheriff Pruitt's replacement, a younger man named Burroughs who was learning the territory with commendable diligence. The Redmond property and the Rocking Bee were both established and running, and the combined operation that she and Gilbert managed together had a reputation in the valley for fair dealing and solid cattle, which was the reputation that lasted, the one built on years of showing up and doing the work. On a September evening in 1893, 11 years after Maria had stepped off the train with her carpetbag and her letter, she sat on the porch of her house while the mountains went through their colors, and Thomas, who was 9 now and built along the same solid lines as his father, was doing his schoolwork at the kitchen table inside, and Clara June, who was 6, was sitting on the porch step with the careful focus of a child working out an arithmetic problem in her head. Gilbert came out of the barn and crossed the yard in the evening light and came up onto the porch and sat beside her, and they watched the mountains together and listened to the valley sounds, the cattle at the water and the windmill turning, and Thomas's voice inside asking a question about something in his reader. "Ruiz says the south pasture is looking better than it has in 3 years," Gilbert said. "The rains helped," she said. "They did," he agreed. A moment of quiet. "Are you happy?" he asked. She turned to look at him. He asked her this occasionally, not from anxiety but from genuine attention, because he was a man who believed in taking stock of things that mattered rather than assuming their continued health without checking. She looked at the mountains. She looked at the house, repaired and expanded and lived in fully. She looked at Clara June on the step with her arithmetic and heard Thomas's voice inside and felt Gilbert's hand find hers on the arm of the chair. "Completely," she said. "You." "More than I know how to say," he said. She squeezed his hand and they sat together on the porch of the house that had been a failing intention and was now a full life, and the mountains completed their evening colors and the first stars appeared over the valley, and the wind moved through the grass with the sound of distant conversation, and everything that had needed settling was settled, and everything that needed tending was tended, and everything that needed to be found had been found.